All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel Tutt and C, Derick Varn are in the house. We're here to celebrate and launch our new book. Welcome, everyone. So nice to see some familiar faces in the stream. We are live streaming on Derick's channel as well as Emancipations. We have some extremely exciting guests to introduce you. I'm even wearing my Communist Playful t-shirt for all of you, since this is a celebration of our little pamphlet, book that's just come out with Revol Press. I'm going to put a link in the chat to purchase the EPUB or the print copy. Of course, we encourage you to pick up the actual physical book, which is just 500 words less than Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, which of course was an important bestseller. So your task is to help us become a left-wing bestseller. If we can pull that off, that would be quite something, and especially good for Revol Press, which is an indie press based in the UK, and which we, very much admire, working with Mike and Bram. Our first interview was with Bram on Strange Exiles. You can check that out on our YouTube page as well as on our Patreons. The book actually has already been reviewed twice, one by Cosmonaut Magazine and the second by Geese Magazine. I just finished reading the Geese review, which was unsurprisingly, Derick, a little critical. They are Leclau and Mouffe, American communists, trying to really celebrate or valorize left populism, whereas we are trying to scrutinize left populism. So, but it was a respectful and comradely review. I thought it was interesting. Many of the writers are somewhat anonymous writers for Geese, so I'm not sure exactly who Ant is, but I hope to meet them. I think some of them live in Washington, D.C. If they do, they're more than welcome to come to our D.C. events. We'll have 2 events in D.C., one at People's Book and one at Busboys and Poets. We'll have an event in Baltimore. We'll have an event in Philadelphia, and we'll have an event in New York City, all in 1 week, starting July 20th to July 25th. So in 1 month from now. Yes. Well, we already have Mike McNair in the backstage, which is a very, very special treat, Derick. I think that, Professor McNair even read our book is what we consider, frankly, a great blessing, because we think his work is so exceptional. His work on socialist strategy, which was published, I forget the exact year, but 2008, 2009, I want to say, was that book was released. Is that right? But it's aged extremely well as an intervention. And so to get his endorsement of the book, as well as John Bellamy Foster with a monthly review, was really great. Somebody said that we're going to do an exposition of the book. I'm not sure we're going to do an exposition of the book today. That will come in our podcast interviews, for which we have many planned. And if you want to interview us, part of the reason we wrote this is to engage in debates and dialogues and discussions and have critical exchanges. Let me also say, before I kick it to Varn to say a few things, we invited commentators in the panel tonight, not to reflect a perfect symmetry of our views, but rather to bring people on that have particular perspectives that we find valuable. So we're bringing on an anarchist who is a working class academic, Lisa McKenzie, because her work on the working class in Britain is quite interesting. Mike McNair is a great theoretician of socialist strategy. We're bringing him on primarily to talk in that vein. And Benjamin Studebaker is a thinker who is just a very fine and excellent thinker of politics and of political theory. So it's a panel that I think could not be more suited for this book. Derick is on the road, so you can see I don't know what's going on with that background, but it's quite interesting. What is that?
It's a Batik screen. So
okay. This is live. Praise the sun. It is live. We are all live. Yeah, we're gonna go on. We are open to going on to any podcast to talk about our book for sure. So if you have suggestions in that vein, let us know. But Derick, how is your vacation, your travel? Are you in Mexico right now?
No, I'm in the Mojave Desert actually. So
Okay.
hence the linen shirt. But it is very hot. But we are doing well. And we're doing good. I just got back from Mexico, though. I was in Baja California for the weekend. So I went and saw Jason Miles, friend of our mutual shows.
Excellent. Well, that's great, Derick. Let me share the screen to where folks can get a hold of the books and learn about upcoming events, because the cool thing is that they're all in one place. And then we'll bring on our first panelist here. So give me one sec to share this. Here it is, comrades. And I'm going to, can you guys see that okay?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, great. There it is. You see, so you see, if you go to this link, which I just put in the YouTube there, EPUB download on the top left allows you to get the book in EPUB, which means you can bring it onto your phone. It's about an 80-page read. It's written in the style of a pamphlet, and we feel that this is a jam-packed with a lot of things that we've wanted to say for many years about the status of the left, about the crisis of class politics, about the errors we see in the left populist horizon, a whole number of things about this complicated relationship we have to Christopher Lasch, the American historian. So much of, I think, the text is a sort of way to offer some type of statement. But importantly, at the end, we recognize that the question of strategy that we open is really an homage to, or an invitation to, something that must be much more seriously developed, including the concept of social reproduction. We're most likely going to write further and more deeply on that topic. And I'll say for myself, it's been very interesting to write with someone else. I've written 2 books by myself. It was a very enjoyable experience to have that back and forth. It's something I recommend that comrades do. If you live in Mexico, you can purchase the book. The UK, Australia, New Zealand. And if you scroll down, you'll see here information about the book tour with ways to RSVP to the events here. Okay. The New York event's going to be fabulous with Sean and In This Wreckage podcast at Woodbine, which is a very dynamic venue. We'll be selling books at each location. Red Emma's is a great left-wing coffee shop bookstore in Baltimore. The DC event is not listed here, but that's going to have a bunch of DSA comrades that will be on the panel. And in Philly, it's going to be very DSA centered, because they've invited us to really talk about some of the internal politics, but also some of the directions of DSA at this moment. Derick is currently a member of the DSA. I'm not a member of the DSA, but maybe they'll allow me to make some of comments. But that is how you get a hold of the book. So before we bring on Mike McNair, Derick, what was the experience like writing this book for you? And what did you want to achieve, I guess?
Well, I wanted to sit down with someone who's thought about some of the same issues as me, aka you, and start hashing out the outline to a theoretical and strategic response to what I see as the cul-de-sac of left populism, which I think is a natural recourse to left crises of working class organizing. I would actually see that it's one of the many ways that you can sort of have your cake and eat it too in regards to workers, particularly if you're trying to sell an agenda of immediate reform that is not attached to a minimum maximum program or some kind of other program that has an orientation for those reforms to actually add up to something. And we didn't talk about that element of it so much in the book, but I wanted to outline what the theoretical reasons for the need for something like that might be. Because left populism is like many things. It has a very, very low bar to entry, and a very, very nebulous criterion for success. And when we were talking about this, we were talking about the problem of intellectuals and how that developed in the PMC discourse in the 20th century and what the merger thesis really was and how that may apply. We started talking about like Manichaean views of class conflict without denying that capitalism is primarily based on a binary class conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie fundamentally. But that even Marx had to contend that there were lots of classes and stratas and social factions that complicate a very simple antagonism. These other like classes were going to be a problem. So that's what I was thinking about. I also wanted to sit down with you and address, Christopher Lasch, try to start thinking about the merger thesis again in a more post-Podemos, post-Syriza context because of when the book was originally written. I think it spoke to the time, but now we have more evidence for the limitations of that strategy. And then we just come off reading all these like almost elegiacs for the millennial left, including the one written by Anton Yeager and Anthony Borriello on populism. And I remember thinking they've declared populism dead, and I don't know that it actually is yet. I think it might come back if we're not careful because we haven't really understood completely the problems that make it so appealing in in at least a 150-year time frame. So, we don't go all the way back to the beginnings of socialism, but we do go back very briefly, admittedly, to the 19th century and kind of trace things out.
I think that's helpful. To an extent, we see populism as a kind of necessary effect of the organization of political economy in our time. And that's why I think the Stuart Hall argument about authoritarian populism is very central for us, even though we're somewhat critical of it. While at the same time, we sort of recognize that the mobilization of popular energies and the way that the left responds to, whether it be spontaneous social movements or kind of extra institutional activity that is sort of spontaneous in its own way, that there seems to be some kind of correlation between the main intellectual theorists of populism and their abandonment of certain Marxist commitments. So they sort of take that the rise of spontaneous social movements, and we sort of they take that in a sort of uncritical way, and they're not interested to revisit or recommit to a more rigorous Marxist orientation to thinking politics. And that introduces a whole series of debates that we try to engage in. And we see the populist seduction in a lot of Marxist thinkers. Not only Laclau and Mouffe. Laclau and Mouffe seem to us, especially emerging out of Eurocommunism, I think you could say, as a set of thinkers that are trying to really center left populism as the predominant strategy. But before that, you still had a lot of post-war Marxist thinkers that were sort of abandoning certain core Marxist commitments. So naturally, I think some readers may look at our text and they may wonder, how is it possible to reintroduce a more rigorously Marxist form of politics? And I wonder what you would say to that, Derick, and then we'll bring on Mike immediately after. What would you say to that? Like, in the sense of how would you assess the way that we are trying to respond to the post-Marxist embrace of left populism?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we are doing is not just doing the normal, peon to, postmodernism sucks and it caused all these problems and blah, 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 blah. What I think it particularly inspired you to kind of go through it theoretically and me to go through it in some ways more, I was very concerned about industrial numbers and whatnot, was why these 50s and 60s strategies became so hard to do. Most of them were built for more formal employment during Fordism, with little piecework and a very staid, if collaborationist union movement that had a lot of clout, even if it was collaborating with capital. And that those things don't exist now in the same way. And this means that for us, the political, we can say we need a party, we can say we need a program, and I'm a believer in both, right? Particularly, I'm a believer in the old min-max program of the classical SPD and of the early Bolsheviks. But I would also say that there's a certain way in which just wishing for that isn't good enough because of changes in the economy, and just asserting it doesn't lead to mass politics in any way. And so we had to kind of go back and say, if we were going to hold these classical, early 20th century Marxist views, but look at where we are right now, what would we need to do? And some things we have to look at is just the different state of where the working class is at, a highly lumpenized population within all the stratas of the working class, this former petit bourgeois class that is now kind of a new petit bourgeois a la Palancis that is its own problem, because even if it is part of the working class in a technical sense, its habitus, its development is assumed petit bourgeois norms, and the inability for us to deal with the right populism tends to fail of its own internal contradictions, but left populism tends to also have similar problems with trying to manage a state and deliver policies, which is primarily what they focus on, without fundamentally changing the engine of how those policies work. So whether it's currency, or whether it's an expanded welfare state, whether it's a jobs guarantee, how do you do that in the context of democracy under capital in specific? And what we say is it's just not possible, really. It's not a viable program, at least not for any long period of time. And I think we see this in Mitterrand. I think that is why things like Move from the Cloud even happened, was a response to that. So,
well, thank you for that. And I apologize for managing my time poorly, but I'd like to now introduce our first panelist, the great Mike McNair, who is a academic associated with the University of Oxford, and also a columnist for the Weekly Worker, member of the Provisional Central Committee of the CPGB, and, according to the bio on the Weekly Worker, an old-fashioned ex-trot political hack. This is not my words. This is the bio. And he writes on a wide range of issues. most pertinently for this conversation, Mike McNair is the author of the book called Revolutionary Strategy, published in 2008, and he's currently working on a second edition. Welcome, Professor McNair, to the program. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Derick, for the invitation. It's certainly an interesting, serious and interesting discussion, I hope.
Well, your book was something we read closely in thinking about strategy. At the end of our text, we hint at strategy. We make an overture to the question of strategy. We really wanted to ask you questions now that we have you here. So not so much to talk about our book, although you can say whatever you want about it. We understand you're working on a second edition of Revolutionary Strategy, which we should probably say for a lot of socialists, this book has been a sort of treasure. I think it must be said, like, especially in the cosmonaut world, people often cite it as highly influential. And it's usually associated with the neo-Kautskyist revival. So I'm sure you're aware of that. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I don't like being called great, but thank you. The neo-Kautskyist revival, it's unfortunate. When I was formulating this thing, I identified the strategy of the right wing of the socialist movement before 1914 with Eduard Bernstein, which was actually incorrect, because it would have been clearer to identify it with Eugen von von Vollmar and other advocates of coalitionism, which Bernstein was more of a Marxist before he became a Fabian than these other guys. I identified the left wing with Rosa Luxemburg, though in fact it would have been stronger to identify the left wing with Benito Mussolini and Arturo Labriola. And there's a whole load of other people who were radical syndicalists. Luxemburg was sort of between the radical syndicalists and the centre, and I identified the centre with Kautsky, and that was sort of, hey, I did actually go on to say, look, Kautsky became a scab in 1914, and very much more clearly became a scab in 1917, but I should have identified it with Babel, because actually the strategic line, which I identified as the quote Kautsky line, was in reality August Babel and Wilhelm Liebknecht's strategic line developed for the SPD, German SPD, in the 1870s and continuing down to approximately 1914. Indeed, oh dear, what's the man's name? There's an German-American academic at UPenn who's written on the extent to which the SPD was still in its majority strongly anti-imperialist down to 1914, and also that the SPD leadership in summer 1914 was engaged in planning a general strike to force the Prussian suffrage question. And these plans were overtaken by the war, and then conversely, it's Jens Uwe Guettel, Guettel, yeah. And then in reality, what happens is very rapidly in summer 1914, the war is coming. Everybody identifies it. It's going to be an attack on Germany from both sides. Nobody expects what actually happens, which is that both the French invasion of Germany and the Russian invasion of Germany are smashed, and the Germans wind up occupying large parts of France and the former Tsarist Empire. But the Chancellor, the Reichschancellor, offers the trade unions full legalization and major concessions if they'll back the war effort.
Mm-hmm.
and they backed the war effort. Okay, so my point is, it was misleading to identify the center with Kautsky. And in response to one of the reviews, in fact, I wrote in response to David Broder's review of the book that I could have written the whole book with not using SPD history and quotations from Kautsky and so on, but using Lenin. Because in reality, the strategic line of the SPD center is the line of the Bolsheviks. The line of the left wing, Luxemburg and Pannekoek and those guys, was the line that was adopted by Bogdanov, Lunacharsky, the Vapered tendency in 1910 at the time of their split with Bolshevism.
Interesting.
Anyhow, that's so yeah. Neo-Kautsky is what it is good for, though, I think, is just the identifying the continuity between Bolshevism and the center tendency of the Second International. Yeah.
What would you? One of the things that's important for Derick and I in our book is the revisitation of the merger thesis. And this is something you touch on a bit. And I know you write on this. You find it to be a part of the neo-Kautskyiist portfolio of strategy, let's say. Could you say a few things about its importance and how you perhaps see it today?
Okay, it's Lars Lee's formula, the merger thesis. It's an interesting thing because actually it's a little bit, there's an odd sense in which it's actually a little bit misleading. Yeah. The context in which this stuff emerges is that the social democracy, the Austrian social democracy, is advocating for a revision of the Heinfeld program, which would make the socialist content of socialist politics grow automatically out of the immediate class struggle and the consciousness of the working class. Yeah. At the same time that proposal is going on, Ben Lewis has written on this, at the same time that proposal is going on, it's also the case that the trade unions in the German right-wingers among the trade union leadership are arguing that these intelligentsia types like Kautsky and Parvus and Kuno and Luxemburg and so on and so forth should shut up because it's not working class. The emancipation of the working class is the task of the working class itself, and that means the only legitimate representatives of the working class for this purpose is the trade union bureaucracy. This is something which resurfaces, and in point of fact, actually, it's part of the agenda of the Ehrenreichs in the professional managerial class stuff. This is directed against the largely student-based far left in the 1970s. And in favor of their project, I can't remember what the hell it was called, which wound up being part of the creation of DSA. But it was a project of, as which has come up over a series of times since, we need a party, working class party. That means one based on the trade union bureaucracy. Yeah. Actually, the trade union bureaucracy are just as much intelligentsia as the students. They're just intelligentsia who've come up by a different career path. Yeah. And that, I thought, was Kautsky. I think Kautsky's response to the arguments of trade union bureaucracy and also the arguments of the Austrians was to say, actually, the idea of socialism comes from outside the workers' movement and not from within the workers' movement. That resurfaces in Lenin and what is to be done. He's just flat. The stuff, notorious material, Lars Lee has dug up the correspondences. It's just direct quotations out of Kautsky. But it's wrong, because what Marx's communism comes from worker communist circles of the 1830s and early 1840s. You know, what is the scientific element of it is not the idea of socialism. That spontaneously grows out of the working class itself, in the form of Spencean communism, in the form of Owenism, in the form of etc. Of Flora Tristan in France, all of these guys. Okay, Flora Tristan is intelligentsia, but utopian communism, utopian socialism grows up in the working class itself. The idea of working class political action also grows up in the working class itself, in Chartism. What Marx and Engels bring to the show is German philosophy, and in particular the critique of the left Ricardian political economy, which was the dominant view of the workers' movement, and which Proudhon also defends this left Ricardian political theory, which says, okay, capitalism is a bad thing, but we can overcome capitalism through cooperatives and mutualism and attacking interest and rent without actually attacking profit and private ownership. So the science element that Marx and Engels are bringing in is that stuff, the science of political economy and the German philosophical foundation of the idea that the whole stuff is contradictory. So the in that sense the merger thesis is it's a misleading idea. Now, where we are now is a very strange and different situation. And the strange and different situation essentially is, let's suppose that the bourgeoisie abolished welfare, altogether abolished welfare. Well, leave aside that this is going to lead to piles of the corpses of the unburied, starved to death, unemployed on the privatized streets, needing to be dealt with somehow by the private owners of these streets. The consequence of the mega deaths which would be involved in the capitalist class abolishing welfare in the imperialist countries, or indeed actually in the colonial countries, is going to be the labour market becomes so tight that wages shoot up and profitability goes into that you get classic profit squeeze situation. So the reality is that the conception of lumpenization is actually a misunderstanding of what's going on. What's going on is that the reserve army it's true that there's a sort of lumpenization, but the point is that the reserve army of labour has become necessarily so big, and the productivity of labour has become so high, that if the capitalist class abolish welfare, besides leave aside the fact of corpses on the unburied streets, the labour market becomes incredibly tight, wages go up. It's also the case, before that happens, all the petty bourgeoisie, the little cafes, the little bookstores, the little charity shops and goodwill stores in the United States and stuff all go bust. Because the demand, the demand to sustain the existing petty bourgeoisie rests on the current population being fed and able to afford third-hand, fourth-hand clothes, and etc., etc., etc. So that it's the utopia which the guys who advocate for getting rid of, but then the consequence of that is that the work that we are already in. We are not in pure capitalism. We are in halfway socialized capitalism. We exist in a world in which the working class is subsidized through state action, including in the States, for example, by the regulation of utility prices, by direct subsidies of agriculture in order to hold food prices down, and so on and so on and so on. So the problem which we face is not a socialization or communization problem. It's that we already have socialization, but it's politically controlled by the capitalist class as a class. So the merger thesis in that sense, if we ask the question, why is the mass of the working class not attracted to socialism? There's two reasons, one of which is Soviet Union. Nobody believes in, and nobody can after the Soviet Union believe in Soviet-style socialism. Number two, actually, we're already in a sort of socialization of and we can't, without posing a democratic alternative to capitalist management, as long as we have a managerialist left, we tell the working class that nothing is possible beyond managerialist capitalism. So it's a sort of, I don't think it's, there is the political economic change, but the political economic change is one of the distorted form of the first stages of the transition from capitalism to socialism, not just a decay. Is that helpful?
It certainly is. I get a resonance of state monopoly capitalist theory in some of the, or even some of these old formulas of neo-capitalism and what you're saying about the state subsidizing elements of the working class and so on. I mean, I have more questions about what you're saying. We have people in the chat, and I think this would behoove us to ask this also, to slightly switch gears, if we could, to get your thoughts on left populism and the success or the kind of merits or the downsides to it as a strategy, specifically the 1985 intervention of hegemony and socialist strategy. We were wondering your thoughts on this text. You're aware of what Derick and I, how we assess it, but perhaps you might add your own perspective on the Laclau legacy and provide your own assessment of it. And we have Lisa McKenzie in the back room. Lisa, if you can hear me, you'll be on shortly. Apologize for being slightly out of schedule. Yeah, but please, would you give us a sense of how you assess Laclau?
Yeah, very, very quick, as far as I can be very quick. The essence of it, we're still fighting the last war. Yeah. In 1941-45, there was a global People's Front unifying, quote, democratic capitalism in the form of the United States. It's a bit weird to call the British state democratic, but they did, with the Soviet Union. Under the banner of the People's Front, then you get the creation of, quote, bureaucratic socialist regimes, not just in Eastern Europe, but also in China and North Korea. And under the framework of the Cold War, in essence, the United States didn't believe that it could trust its soldiers to actually fight a hot war with the Soviet Union in 1946-47 and went for containment. Yeah. And in containment, it was then possible equally for People's Front politics to win in Vietnam, in Cuba, in South Yemen. So all of this is the politics of the People's Front. Okay, the Trotskyists teach us about the People's Front as though it was just the People's Front in France, which leads to the treason of the army officers in 1940, the People's Front in Spain, which loses the Civil War. Um, uh, but the reality is this enormous success of the People's Front, and it's the war. It's like, you know, my ancestors in Britain, at least, were going on and on about the war with Boney and France, right down to 1900, when the early 1900s, the coming war with Germany overtook the memories, political memories of the war with France. So it's within that framework. And then the problem was, okay, the People's Front worked in Cuba, in Vietnam. It didn't work in Indonesia. It didn't work in Iran. It didn't work in Iraq. It didn't work in Egypt. It didn't work in Syria. It didn't work in Chile. And in particular, it didn't work in Chile. There was an explosive growth of Trotskyism in the late 1960s, early 1970s. The communists were seriously concerned about the explosive growth of Trotskyism, and they moved sharply to eliminate the class element, the working class element in the People's Front by saying, actually, the working class is specifically the working class in the capitalist countries is no longer a working class. It's purely a labor aristocracy. And therefore, where our perspective has to be a populist perspective. It's a perspective. It's not directly Maoism, full-blooded Maoism. I know Yasemin Mather, who was with the FEDI, People's FEDI in the 70s, is very sharply critical of me whenever I say these guys were Maoists, because the reality is they weren't Maoists. They were but they were influenced by the Maoist version of the People's Front. And the upshot of that then is wokeism, as it were, whatever the hell you want to call it. Everything except class is politically central. But it's not, it was already, God, what's the man's name? C. Wright Mills and the SDS leaders were already saying, oh, this working class is conservative, it's uninteresting, it's the marginal elements, it's the students, etc., etc., etc. But all of this it's the People's Front. And the problem is, okay, we also get things which are old, which were told anew, like authoritarian populism. That's just, it's just one of the wings of capitalist politics. What was written, called, quote, the party of order in Marx's 18th Brumaire analysis of the events in France in the 1848 revolution. The moral panics, okay, it's a British criminologist who came up with the language of moral panics, but the actual practice goes back to the Statute of Trail Bastants of 1303. We get a succession, the criminal justice system throws up moral panics as a normal aspect of its operation. So we get this sort of grand theorization. Okay, then it's tested in practice. And what do we get? Actually, Syriza, Podemos, Rifondazione goes better, but then when they enter into government, they destroy themselves. So it's the aspiration, in a sense, it's as much as anything else, the aspiration to get immediately into government, as opposed to building an oppositional political voice, both in the outside and in the parliaments, which has the effect of, that when they're oppositional, the PCI and the PCF, when they were excluded by capital from entering into government, build up round themselves powerful trade unions, workers' education, festivals, cultural impact, etc., etc. When they try and go into government, that wrecks them. So in that sense, that's just as much true of the populists as well, only it's more true of the populists because precisely the point of the populists is exactly to achieve government and not to build an opposition. That's me. I hope that's some use.
No, it's useful, helpful. It's something that we track going back to the People's Party in the U.S. and that distinct origin point. But you're pointing to this very interesting popular front origin to populism. Many questions emerge from this historical breakdown that you just offered, but we do have somewhat limited time. I'm going to kick it to Derick Varn to maybe say a final word to you, to invite him into this conversation, and then we'll go to our next speaker. Derick, would you like to jump in real quick?
Well, I am interested in this relationship between reinvigorating populism and this, what we might call overly mature capital, because I agree with Mike that we have a situation where the welfare state's actually required to have a slack enough labor market for profits to be valorized, and that this plays off a need for an increasingly strong and interventionist state, but also the capitalists don't particularly want to
pay for it.
Yeah, they don't want to pay for it. Yeah, exactly, and they don't want to deal with the realization of what that welfare means. Because, for example, if you do let the mass die-off happen that would accompany this, since you've created so much surplus population, you would have a wide open labor market. We've already seen that actually start to manifest post-COVID. We lost, in the United States alone, we lost 1 million people. We have massive retirements, and we started seeing this attempt to automate things that we haven't seen automated before, almost perfectly timed with that reality. I do think that does have a material effect on a lot of the working class, so in that they are made dependent on various political actors. And one of the critiques of our book is we don't say what populism is. I would say that we imply that it's a modern variation of Bonapartism, which itself is a variation of Caesarism, which is just using an authority figure to overcome seeming contradictions. And I think one of the ironies of left populism is that it would actually give a lot of these, if it worked, which I don't think it can, depending on what we mean by it. But if you can just pass a policy suite that would create a welfare state that would enable more largesse, it would either save capitalism to some degree, or it could accelerate decay because of the impossibility of maintaining such a generous welfare state and maintaining any form of profitability at all. And I just wanted to ask you if you think those two things are related as to why both why the situation with the welfare state makes populism even conceivable, because you do have a welfare state, you do have socialization in some level, maintaining basic functionality, but also that any attempt to improve it would cut into profits so significantly at this point that it could actually be a danger to capitalists are in a bind either way, I guess, and any movement in either direction could cause a problem for them.
Well, we can see it in a sense. The turn which was taken in the middle 1970s, during the 1970s, the US went off the gold standard, floated the dollar, which was a rip-off from ripping off the French and the Germans and the Japanese, and scammed the Latin American countries and a number of the East European countries into the belief that marginalism was true, and that therefore if you borrowed money you could go into virtuous growth which would pay off your borrowings, which then turns into debt crises. At the same time, I want to be a little bit cautious and in a sense, the strength of the working class in, when you've referred to in the opening the point that a lot of the left strategies of the 1970s assumed mass trade unionism. I worked for 2 years at Morris's Cowley fitting Speedos into Morris Marina cars. The whole plant was union, 100% union. The union branch, the trade union leadership was Trotskyist. And just that sense of, before I was there, it wasn't the case while I was there, but before I was there, people who'd been there before told me if a foreman put a hand on the car, it would go down to the end of the line untouched. That level of workers' control of what was going on. Okay, so clearly the Thatcher, Reagan, etc., is a response to this is what containment led to in terms of enormously powerful trade union organisation, and equally workers very willing to walk off the job if it was a bad job, because there was always other jobs to go to. There's a really low rate of unemployment, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, that's true. But the other side of it is, suppose that all the capitalists squeeze suppose that every capitalist country is forced to squeeze the wage share in order to compete. When first the Americans and the Brits squeeze the wage share, the consequence is that the French and the Germans and the Japanese have to squeeze the wage share.
Mm-hmm.
And the logical consequence of this is that the gains which are made to each individual capitalist are cashed in the form of market share and price cutting, rather than being cashed in the form of reinvestment. The upshot of that then is that at the end of the day, what has to happen is a proper crash. What's happened is that every single crash which should have happened, 1987, 1998, 2000, 2009, has been bailed out. COVID went part of the way to being a sort of managed crash, but it wasn't. And in that sense, I don't think the reality is that there could be a new wave of capitalist development, like the new wave in the 1950s to 1960s. But in order for that to happen, the United States empire has to meet the fate of the British Empire in 1914 to 1940, 1914 to 1945. Because the drag, the enormous overhang of debt and the immense reverse pyramid of fictitious capital, which is built on top of the actual productive operation, is so large it needs to crash in order for for capitalism to progress. And I don't know how the hell it's going to happen. What we objectively, the UK, you asked me about British politics. We've had 7 prime ministers in the last 10 years, and I expect that we'll have 2 more before the next general election. The underlying reality is that the UK is bankrupt and has been selling off capital assets to make up the difference between its income and its expenditure. And all that's left to be sold off now is the hospitals and the universities, because all the big industrial operations are now US owned, and business operations in the UK are now US owned. Quite a lot of the actual land is US owned, and so on and so forth. So the UK is on the road to bankruptcy, but no politician can admit to it. And because no politician can admit to it, every prime minister in the last 10 years is, oh fuck, we're fucked. We can't actually deliver. He's unable to deliver anything. And that's, in a sense, okay, that's a particular edge, because other countries aren't in quite the same situation, but it's a particular edge of the consequences of the grandiose Ponzi scheme which was created by US finance capital in the 1970s.
Well, I just want to we want to thank you for your time. We apologize. We have to move to the next speaker. But this
thank you for having me.
Phenomenal, and we hope to bring you back to dig into. I mean, we just touched the surface here, but what we touched was quite compelling, and I think folks are very much interested to hear more, and perhaps maybe we could examine a future conversation here where we're permitted more time. But we thank you for engaging with our book, and for the blurb, and for joining us. And when the final thing, and just if you can answer in 30 seconds, what's the story with the second edition of your strategy book? What's the status of that?
Well, we're exploring options, but the basic idea is actually going to be to reprint with an introduction and perhaps an appendix, rather than to completely rewrite, because the danger of completely rewriting is that it would sprawl all over the place and lose the focus, which is the great merit of the book is its fairly tight focus.
Beautiful. Well, thank you again, and hope you have a wonderful evening, and until next time.
Thank you. So I should log off, yeah?
For sure. All the best. Thank you. All right, everyone. That was incredible. Really honored that McNair jumped on. Lisa, we're so sorry to keep you waiting. Let me introduce our next speaker, Lisa McKenzie, who's a working class academic in the UK. Her politics are anarchist. She and I had a brilliant conversation on class theory in Bourdieu and Marx. So she does a lot of work in sociology. She's studied the history of the British working class, and has written a lot about her own family's experience with the rise of Thatcherism and neoliberalism, and the way that has fragmented the British working class. And she writes and comments widely in British media on left-wing politics, class politics, and so on. We're very honored to have Lisa McKenzie join us. Welcome.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that, actually. So don't worry about leaving me there, because I really enjoyed listening to that. And also, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for letting me read the book. I've got to say, over the last couple of years, I've really fallen out of love with academia completely. It's been sort of very stale, especially in Britain. Sociology, which is my discipline, has been extremely bland, to say the least. And I have almost fallen out of love completely with having any sort of academic debate up until today. When because I've read the book, started the juices flowing a bit, thinking, oh, okay, what do I think about this? And also thanks to Mike, because there is so much to do. There is still so much to do. And I think sometimes when you're in the eye of the storm, which is how I feel as a working class woman in Britain, and Mike really summed up the British situation right now, although it is a bit more complicated than 7 prime ministers, 10 years. People, at the moment we're having this big conversation in Britain: are we ungovernable? No, we're not ungovernable. We've got politicians who are lying to us, and everybody knows they're lying to us. So there's no sort of the working class in Britain are not fooled. They know exactly what is happening, and they're waiting for a politician to stop lying. That we may wait forever. I think we probably will. But So reading the book, I've got loads and loads of notes, but thinking about what Mike said and thinking about how we sort of continue with this conversation, I think one of the things that really struck me about the book, and this sort of concept of populism, what does it mean? So in Britain, we've had this conversation about left-wing populism, which was sort of Jeremy Corbyn stuff, now the Greens, and also the right-wing populism, which is Reform, and Nigel Farage. And I think your book really does start to describe and explain the problems with populism, because it is a neoliberal construct. That's what I think we should be able to argue that all populism, whether it's left-wing or right-wing, I also have this same argument with the good nationalists, the Scottish nationalists, which is also a neoliberal construct as well, actually. But the politics that we're living with right now, I would say, are extremely anti-working class. And that is from the left or from the right. And that's where I would like to state my claim today with this. And there was something a bit right at the beginning of the book. It's on the first page. And it is a quote from Marx, and it says, "Let the dead bury their dead." And I think that really sums up both right-wing populism and left-wing populism. Both cheeks of the same arse are rehashing the same old stuff. In the right wing, it's from the 1970s and 1980s, that somehow a free market can still solve the problem. And from the left wing, they're going back even further with sort of romanticizing the working class. And what they do is they romanticize people like me. No, not people like me, actually. People like my family. People like my dad, who was a coal miner and was on strike in 1984. If anybody knows about the strike in 1984 in Britain, my dad was a Nottinghamshire striking miner, and that was in a part of the coalfields that all worked. It was extremely conflictual part of British history. Actually, politically, it was massive, because it was almost pitted as Thatcherism taking on the old guard of socialism and communism through the placebo of Arthur Scargill. So it was Thatcher versus Scargill. It was the new sort of petty bourgeois, rise of the petty bourgeois, rise of the neoliberalism, taking on the old guard of the working class and the communism and the socialism of the past. Of course, none of that was true, because when you were in the middle of that, which I was, because I was a 16-year-old teenager leaving school in 1984, no qualifications, my future was mapped out. I was going to go and work in the same factory that my mum was working in, which was Pretty Polly. It was making tights. And so these big political concepts of the right versus the left, of the new versus the old, was kind of lost on those of us that were in the middle of it. Because the truth was about working class people at that time. It's been re-narrated afterwards. But the truth is, at the time, in that 1980s political turmoil, is those of us that were in the middle of that fight were fighting for our communities. We were fighting for our families, for our communities, for our jobs. And that was really what the fight was about. Since that time, both left and right, and this is where I like the let the dead bury their dead, have romanticized who we were and what we did. And they've turned this into some sort of memorial of a politics that never was, and a politics that could never be. And instead, what has happened, and you've noted this in the book, where you've said that the working class has been reduced to a moral category. And you picked that up, and that really spoke to me, because that is exactly how I feel British politics especially really is. And the moral category is being narrated and decided by the British middle class. And this is something that's not in the book, that I've really thought about because of the book, and something I've been thinking about a long time, is who is narrating these moral categories and what do they mean? And this feeds into populism, right versus left, right versus wrong, culture wars, identity politics. And it's who is narrating. And obviously this is my Bourdieusian theory sort of moving into play. Theory that I'd forgotten that was important up until till I read the book. Because I've been so entrenched recently. I'm back in the mining communities where I live. Things are really tough here, really tough. Jobs are very difficult to get. We've got mass unemployment of young people. Working class people's real life living standards are in free fall. I have not known this as bad as this ever in my lifetime. And I'm working class industrial woman. And the situation in Britain now is becoming quite unstable, actually, through poor politics, and that's the poor politics, I think, of populism. That one side is promising one thing, another side is promising another thing, and none of them will be honest about what is happening. And so I think we're moving into quite a dangerous period of politics. And I think this moral narration of who working class people are is happening. And it's nasty, actually. It's very nasty. It's cruel. And so therefore, what and who is narrating that is the British middle class, perhaps even what we could argue the international middle class. I've really thought about the term bourgeois, and I've not thought about it in this term so deeply before until I read the book. What do we mean when we're talking about the bourgeois? Who are they? It's a word that we use all the time, especially people on the left. We talk about the bourgeois. I've been calling people bourgeois bastards for 40 years, but never really thought about what it means. Who is it? Who am I talking about? But what I do talk about and what I do know is this category called the middle class. And it doesn't translate well into American politics. It doesn't translate well. But what has always happened in Britain is the politics of class has not simply been the politics of the working class. It's been the politics of classes. And it's been the relationships between those classes. And I think the politics where we have now is very much narrated by a middle class who still has cultural capital and cultural power, but is losing economic power and economic resources. But they still hold on to the cultural part of the middle class. And that is, and one of the things I've always argued, is the way that the middle class move in Britain is they move in a way so they are invisible, so they are ordinary, so they're just doing their thing. They're not narrated in the same way as the working class are. And so the working class right now in Britain are being narrated into categories. You have immigrant black and brown working class people, narrated by middle class people, not by working class people, and definitely not by themselves, as virtuous, good, put upon, and victims. And again, this is, and Mike sort of started to talk about this, these are politics of old. So the victimhood of black and brown working class people is the noble savage. And this is old politics. This is not new politics. But at the same time, you've got the white working class who are being narrated as populists, old-fashioned, looking back, residuum. So that word residuum came up when Mike was speaking out, because I've written about the residuum. Residuum is a Victorian term for the working class. And what residuum means, it's the people who drop to the bottom, who are the sedent or the shit. They're the no good. And so the working class is being narrated in Britain as between residuum, and then also you've got the valiant working class of old. But none of these things ring true at all, because none of it is true. What this is narration by a class system that is desperately trying to hold on to their position but not be seen. I don't know if any of this is making any sense.
Of course it is, Lisa. Thank you. First of all, we are honored that the book seized you and elicited some critical thought. And since our last talk 2 years ago on Emancipation's podcast, which I very much enjoyed, I've seen the struggles that you've engaged in, and I've felt that you guys are really in a pickle in the UK on the left. Yeah. And I personally speaking, and I think the perspective of the book is an effort to create solidarity amongst the left without falling into regressive cancel culture or regressive modalities. Say, for example, the section we have on the PMC, one of the arguments you remember there is, look, if anyone wants to stay at all true to a revolutionary project, there has to be, there cannot be some type of liquidationist anti-PMC in our thought. No, if anything, there has to be some type of reform of the ideology of the PMC so as that we develop, we talk about the notion of a class traitor, for example, things like this. While at the same time, we don't want to be class reductionist, because I think that while it may be true that the middle class has a hegemony over morals, we don't want to say then, well, you need a bit of Nietzsche here philosophically to understand the danger, I think, of that careful bait and switch where, well, let's make the working class subject the moral agents. I'm not sure that morals is really, and that's what I wanted to ask you is how do you get at that point? And you do a lot of work, Lisa, in trying to help working class people polish their writing and become spokespeople, public figures, maybe. I've seen you participate in that, working class writers retreats and things of this nature, right? And journals and so on.
Yes, yeah.
So my question is, how do you avoid this kind of crude? Because you see, that's part of what populism does too. Populism is a Manichean class theory that's not materialist. So we don't want to reproduce that type of Manichean moralism. Would you agree?
To a point. But as a materialist, there is a reality to this. And I think this is where we would need to move on, because the left populism has really been pushed by a middle class. That's what I would argue. And they've done this through this idea of a popular front. And again, Mike was talking a little bit about this popular front. And of course, what a popular front and a vanguard movement, which is what I was very critical of the Corbyn movement, because this is what I saw. I saw this attempt to talk about a popular front and about this vanguardism. But in reality, what I experienced and what I saw was this sort of left-wing vanguardism, which is, you obviously are not educated enough, you don't know enough, you're too reactionary at this point, you're not ready at this point, so therefore we will do the thinking and will be the thought of the movement, and at the same time will be the politics of the movement, and also will be the decision makers of the movement as well. And this is what I saw with that left-wing populism. It was again, speaking to the working class as if you're not ready. You're not, you can't read Marx or Proudhon. There's no chance you could read, what we know. So therefore, the ideas can't come from you. And I think this is an old, Mike touched on it as well. This is an old problem that the left has always had, is, unless you can read Marx and Proudhon and Nietzsche, you can't be the ideas people. And so, although I agree with you to a point, we've got to move past that bit. Because like you said, I work with working class people all the time, trying to get their stories out, for them to tell their stories. Because their ideas are coalface ideas. And how can we do that when we've got a left populism that says, well, you can't do that because you're not ready. But then you've got a right populism which says, yeah, tell us your stories. We want to hear them. We're not going to act on any of them or do anything about it, but we are going to listen. And unfortunately, that's where I think we are. And I think we have to be honest about that and then think about how we move past it. Because we've just gone through the last 10 years, and I think in the US it's the same with Trump. We've gone through the past 10 years with accepting that this is the problems that we've got, but not really. And you do come to this in the last chapter, is how do we move on from this? Can we even move on from this? Because I think we've all got to acknowledge we are in uncharted territory now. What Mike said about the UK being bankrupt is absolutely true. Now, is it possible to now build a politics of anything that looks like the politics of old, of socialism, or are we in new territory completely? Do the old words and the old worlds, do they now not translate? And what Mike was talking about with the welfare state, if we removed it immediately. Now, this was an argument in the 1970s. It was an anarchist argument about removing the welfare state, and therefore the working class would rise up because they wouldn't die. They just wouldn't lie in the street and die. They would rise up. So this was an anarchist argument. It was wrong because removing people's means to live and waiting for them to be that angry because their children are dying is not the right thing to do. But we're also not in that period now. We are in a period where a couple of million of us dying might not be such a bad thing, because we've got this concept of residuum, and you've sort of talked about lumpenization.
I wanted to ask you what you think about that. Yeah.
So you talked about this sort of lumpenization. I would call it more residuum, where the old politics from anarchists and socialists and communists is not really translating now, because I don't know if a couple of million people at the bottom claiming welfare would not be dying, would not be appealing to most of the population, actually, including the working class. And I have to be honest about that, because I'm currently doing research in Sutton-in-Ashfield, which is where I live, and where I'm from. And we're looking at Sutton-in-Ashfield, and then we're going to move on to Lee, which is in Greater Manchester. It's actually part of the constituency of Makerfield. It's just on the borders of Makerfield, which is another white working class area like Ashfield. And then we're going to move on to Belfast. So we're looking at the politics of class and what has happened regarding in places of conflict. And one of the conflictual debates that I am I'm not having a debate really, I'm just allowing people to vent. One of the things that people are venting about is people on welfare. Now, these are working class people, some of which are also on welfare, who are extremely angry about people on welfare. Now, I know that has always been part of neoliberal capitalist politics. I know that. But I'm not sure the language of the old really speaks to where we are. And I also looked at, so you were saying right at the beginning that one of the things that you were interested in was, how do we build an internationalist politics of, I think right now we can't do that. I think right now we have to focus hyper-local, because we can't, but we're not in a position where, if you look at E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, and we're building bricks constantly, from the Chartists to the labour movement to the trade unions, we're building bricks. I don't think that's where we are now. I don't think those bricks are now missing. They're not there. People haven't got those bricks to stand on to reach to that next level. I think we're building it from the bottom again. So I'm really not sure that the politics that we've known all our lives, that we've kind of lent on and relied on, can be or are the politics of the future. Is that depressing?
It's extremely depressing, but it's real. It's something we. I want to kick it to Derick Varn and invite him to make a comment and perhaps pose a question to Lisa. And I'm excited to talk to you about the findings of your ethnographic study.
Yeah, it is. I'm working with Professor Keith Gildart at Wolverhampton University, and we're doing this research as a last gasp.
This is a beautiful comment here from one of our friends. How can you abolish proletariat without constructing it in the first place? I think that really hits at some of the things you're saying here. Because there is, and I've seen this in the polemics that you're having with the British left, and even in the post-woke rise of Donald Trump Part 2, there was a moment of reflection on behalf of the British left. And I know we don't have the time to get into this. We don't have the time. But I noticed that you were of the view, well, this is not adequate. You guys are still too middle class oriented and so on. And so I really want to meet and speak to you further about some of these deadlocks in the British left, Lisa. And it's something we should do. But Derick, do you want to jump in? And I don't know if you've met Lisa before, or
I have not.
say hello.
Hi.
Hi, Derick.
Yeah, I've been moved about this working class sociology and this issue of morality, because one thing that I've actually found is that middle class moral norms are taken to be universally obvious in justice discussions. And if you get to have your middle class moral norms, and everything in that string of words is provisional. I don't know what middle class is. The average liberal definition in America versus the liberal definition in Britain are actually very different.
Yeah.
For us, many blue collar people would be middle class, and working class in America is not necessarily always distinct from middle class as it is in Britain, for reasons that I think are because Britain's still a semi-feudal country. But the issue of morality becomes, clear when we talk about populism and things like social justice. So instead of dealing with the actual problems of the working class, of which I would say there are many, and dealing with them from the standpoint of maladaption, you have people who treat the working class as noble victims, which can be used to invoke all kinds of things, particularly on the right. Honestly, they do this all the time, the beleaguered working class person. And then you have people who treat blue collar as why their politics can never go anywhere, because they clearly have the right morality, as if morality and politics were somehow inherently the same.
Yeah, I mean, you've got J.D. Vance,
mm-hmm.
who is the embodiment, is the living embodiment of that right wing sort of. It's the same as that the left wing do with the coal miner. The right wing has done that. You've got J.D. Vance, which I think is the embodiment of actually that. I think it's fascinating, actually.
Oh, I'm fascinating because I, with J.D. Vance, we're almost the same age. I literally could have been in his situation. Like, I almost went into the military. I decided not to, and would have been in a similar role as him, which would probably have been a non-combat, non-infantry soldier. And we have similar backgrounds in that front. And I've always pointed out, well, by himself or by any working class politician, you're not going to know anyone's morality from the fact that they're working class. And if they're a politician in the current environment and they're working class, frankly, they have patrons. And you should probably even maybe make negative assumptions about their morality. The issue for me is that so many people think this is about representation, and that we can represent the working class in some way or the other. And where I'm more interested in is working class power. What would it actually look like? Would you have the same moral problems that a lot of liberals lose a lot of sleep about anti-immigration, stuff like that, if those problems were addressed and the scarcity was not being scapegoated on someone else? I kind of doubt that you would, and historically you didn't, but you do right now. And you either have a theory that says this class is good or bad somehow in inherent terms, or you have to look at it at sociological development and its incentives, right? And I just want to ask you, like, what do you find as a lot of the incentives for the way working class people relate to politics in the UK? Because in the US, the attitude towards politics, even right-wing politics, is hostile. Like, study after study just says it's hostile to all political discussions. Like, the working class people would just rather move on because, and there's sociology to back this up, there is no relationship between their opinion and what actually happens anyway. So if they have reactionary or non-reactionary opinions, that it might be of useful to particular politicians to be able to use that. But the idea that these politicians even really care, I mean, I think you see this clearly in Trump. The moment they had achieved unquestionable power in the second term, there's no need to make any peons to the forgotten working class man at all anymore.
No.
Period.
No, absolutely. I mean, what does working class power look like? Oh God, I'm working class. I've grown up in a working class house with working class friends and family members. What does working class? Do you know what? I'm going to give you a really simple. What does working class power look like? It looks like a community. It looks like a family. That's what it actually looks like. It looks like a community where people find common bonds because of where they live and how they live. And when it works, and again, you would think I would say that as a, you know, I believe in cooperative, you know, I'm a cooperative. You would, but that's what I think. I think it's simple. I think it's simple but complicated. What does working class power looks like? It looks like a community. It looks like a community that's working well, that cares about each other, if only because you rely on each other. That's kind of what it looks like. Obviously, it's always more complicated than that, but it shouldn't have to be, really. Shouldn't have to be that complicated. The complication always comes from the outside.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What do you think of the maxim of Marxism that the proletariat abolish itself as a class, and that this be a directive of our political thought?
Yeah.
How do you understand?
I've had this argument many times. People, middle class academics often throw this at me. Actually, they'll go, "Yes, but Lisa, you know, don't you want a classless society?" Of course, I want a classless society. Yes, of course I do. But what does even that look like? Does that look like we all be middle class? You know, is that what we're aiming for? That sort of middle bit, because I don't want that to happen, because there is something about the culture of struggle and the culture of scarcity that obviously I wish we didn't have, but we do, and out of that has come. You know, I'm British, so I'm gonna. You know, out of that has come the Beatles, Oasis. You know, out of that came David Hockney. You know, out of that came D.H. Lawrence. You know, where I mean, D.H. Lawrence, literally, I live in his village, Bestwood Village. You know, he wrote about Bestwood Village in Sons and Lovers. That's where I live. So, you know, I'm still romantic, and I'm still hopeful that we still, you know, we perhaps get rid of the scarcity and perhaps get rid of the antagonisms, but we keep, you know, the essence. Is that too romantic?
No. The use of romance is a weaponized concept. People could accuse both my position and yours of being falling sway to it. So it's somewhat relative, but we're keeping you late. We don't, and I'm the whole show is slightly delayed, and we have our next speaker, Benjamin Studebaker, in the back room ready to join us. We just want to thank you for reading the book. I mean, it's genuinely fabulous that you found some inspiration and some critical thought in it, which is a reminder to everybody watching and listening to go buy the book on EPUB or print.
It's a good conversation to have with yourself.
That's what we're trying to do. Yeah, is really spark a new conversation for the left. Yeah, so we're really honored you joined us, and this hopefully will be the beginning of you coming back on to Emancipation's program to talk through some of these things in greater depth, especially your new study, which I'm very interested in.
Yeah, well, I will keep you updated to that.
Fabulous, Lisa. Thank you so much for coming on. Until next time.
Yeah, and enjoy the rest of the evening or afternoon or whatever it is.
Most definitely. All the best.
Bye.
Bye. Well, that was excellent. Thanks everyone for continuing your attention to the stream and listening in. Just a quick reminder to check out Revolt Press. I'm going to put a link. I'm going to post it in, I guess I can post it across all channels because we're streaming on Varn's and mine as well. You know, do purchase the book, not only if you want to support Derick Varn and myself, but also to support this indie publisher, Revolt Press, which we really believe in their mission. They have a model of cost share that's very egalitarian with their authors. They treat their authors very well. It's a sort of labor of love. So the more we can stimulate their model, the better we feel. And catch us at a live event. I'll share the flyer in a moment after we bring on Benjamin Studebaker of where we're going to be in Philly, DC, Baltimore, New York. If you're anywhere near, if you even, I think a couple comrades might be driving a couple hours to join us. Let us know if you're doing that. We would honestly love to host you in person. Our next guest literally needs no introduction. He's been on the Varn vlog. He's been on Emancipations, and he is a frequent voice of sanity, but also of critical analysis across the YouTube left, if we could call it that, bread tube. I don't know what we are, but this is Benjamin Studebaker, and he has written 2 books. He focuses on the crisis of democracy. He is a political theorist. He is a very, very interesting scholar of Plato, I must add, and a very interesting interview on Plato with Michael Downs and Nance, which you should check out. And, we're honored to have you here, Benjamin. Welcome. Thank you for agreeing to come. Thank you for, reading the book. We'd like to start off with perhaps your assessment. You have recently written on your Substack a critical assessment of populism. Slopulism, was that the neologism you used, I think?
Yeah, I used slopulism. And thanks for having me on, by the way. It's great to be here to talk about this.
Good, yeah. So let's start with that. Maybe we could, and you can share your thoughts about the pamphlet as you go through that. But what is your assessment of the Leclau move strategy, and how do you assess and diagnose its limitations?
Yeah, I think the Leclau move strategy comes out of the failure of previous strategies and tactics, and an attempt to find something that you can do with a working class that seems less capable than before, and also no new class having emerged that you can straightforwardly entrust, some way to get these broken fragments together in a way that's functional, which sort of acknowledges them as broken fragments and doesn't really have any kind of immediate ambition to make them anything other than or more than broken fragments. Treats the broken fragmentation as kind of just the consequence of the way in which capitalism has been developed. And I think we've seen over the course of the last 40 or 50 years that it doesn't really work as a strategy. Insofar as it has worked as a strategy, it's worked principally for neoliberals who have borrowed heavily from it. I would identify a lot of that Leclauian floating signifier stuff in Obama's Hope and Change, in Trump's Make America Great Again. What does great mean? What is America? The forgotten, who are they? All of these open terms that could mean all kinds of things. And then, of course, politicians strategically change the meaning depending on the situation that they're in, or over time they take on different meanings depending on needs, and different politicians take up the same terms in different ways. So you can be part of a party and there can be factions in the party that understand the language differently, and you might not be sure who's in which faction. I remember the 2020 midterms, Medicare for All became a floating signifier, and everybody's healthcare plan became a Medicare for All plan, even though they were all different plans. And it was very difficult for people to tell them all apart. This kind of thing works on the premise that people are not going to be organized on the basis of their reason, on the basis of something like common sense, or on the basis of their interests as a class. They're going to be machined together by social scientists who are going to just pay really close attention to the discourse, and discourse mage people into a movement. And I thought you guys did a really great job in this book, taking apart the many different but related iterations of this that have come into existence because of a common set of material conditions that have given rise to a frustration with first the old left approaches, then with the new left approaches, and thus with leading ultimately to this populism. And you guys go after Lash, you go after Michael Lind, you go after Laclau and Mouffe, you guys go after Gores, you go after the communization theorists. I thought that bit was awesome because there you were going after people who themselves had gone after this stuff, but had done it inadequately because they remained trapped within the conditions that gave rise to it. So their ability to get out from under it was restricted. And I thought you went after them, but in a way which was not moralistic, which recognized the conditions as the thing which had generated the thought. It was very appropriate. I've very much enjoyed, by the way, in listening to you guys talk about this, the emphasis on dealing with the problem of moralism. Because this is something I've seen a ton of just in the online left scene. There is this inability to stay away from the moralism. There's a tendency to just kind of go up a ladder with it and go, okay, you shouldn't go after the lumpen proletariat for being dysfunctional. That's not right, because there are, of course, conditions that have caused the lumpen proletariat to become dysfunctional. And then it becomes, well, you shouldn't go after the proletariat for scapegoating the lumpen proletariat, because there are, of course, conditions that make it such that the proletariat can't do anything other than scapegoat the lumpen proletariat. And then it becomes, well, maybe you also shouldn't go after the professional class, which invites the proletariat to scapegoat the lumpen proletariat. And then, should we go after bourgeois intellectuals for succumbing to the temptation to be professionalized? And when you guys were talking about the dual, the merger thesis, I got really interested in the merger thesis because the merger thesis posits two different subjects that previously are supposed to cooperate. And I recently, for the podcast The Lack, did an episode on the film Zorba the Greek, which is very much about the failure of the merger thesis. It's a great movie from 1964 about the exhaustion of the merger thesis in 1964. And it's just really well done. The bourgeois intellectual is, wants the Greek to deliver history and to be the driver of change. And the worker can't do that for him and ultimately lets him down, but he won't give up on him anyway. He goes down with him. And then, of course, once they fail, the worker says, well, stay with me. We could try again. And he goes, no, that would be unreasonable. We don't have any credible plan to try again. I'll just go back to my institutions, off in Britain. And of course, the Greek can't argue with this because, it's not like he's got a plan. So in looking at that part of the book in particular, I was really drawn to how you guys focused in on lumpenization, so the kind of ruining of the capacities of the proletariat. And then at the same time, there was also this other tendency, which maybe doesn't get named directly, but you touch on it multiple times in different ways. You talk about it at the level of NGOs, at the level of the Democratic Party. And I think in general, a lot of the talk about populism is about this, which is a kind of corporatism that degrades the bourgeois intellectual into a professional. And then the professionals get blamed as if they were the cause of this. But there's a sort of process by which intellectuals are degraded into this professional activity and degraded into becoming populists and then sloppulists as the activity further degrades. And I think you guys are right to kind of diagnose this as the sort of dual problem. Not only were we unable, 50, 60, 70 years ago to do the merger thesis, but also the two subjects that were the parties to the merger thesis have both deteriorated and degraded. And for reasons that are not their fault, that are not on account of their moral choices, but which come out of the structure of the thing. And so then as I'm reading through that last chapter, I'm thinking about, well, if there is this tendency to make lumpen the proletariat and then to kind of professionalize and corporatize the intellectuals, make the intellectuals corporate, then there's a kind of becoming supplicant of both the two figures. So as you become lumpen proletariat, you're reduced to a position of begging. Your work is very precarious. You don't have consistency with it. You can't be sure that it's going to be there. So you become very scared to make any waves at work. You become very unable to properly organize or properly discuss things. Even expressing your thoughts in or near the workplace could potentially be dangerous to you. But also there is a similar thing that happens to the intellectual who is professionalized, in that the intellectual who's professionalized starts like begging for grant money and begging institutions for increasingly precarious academic jobs or media jobs. You know, all of the entertainment work becomes much more precarious. You can get canceled. Your YouTube channel can be taken away. Somebody can steal your Twitter account. There's all of this precarity and then all of this begging and fear that goes on in both of these two units. And so there's a degradation that occurs on both sides of the merger thesis. And so then you've got people who want to go back to the merger thesis, but you can't do it because the two figures have been degraded. And then people who say, well, the two figures have been degraded, therefore you have to do populism. But now we know from 50 or 60 years of experience that populism doesn't work. And so I am reading at the end of this book, and I'm thinking, is the degradation into lumpen proletariat and professional, is that a kind of necessary degradation that we have to go through? Does socialist politics or left politics have to be compatible in some way with that? And then what would that even mean? Because part of what it means to become lumpen or to become professional is to be degraded relative to the proletariat and the bourgeois intellectuals. So then you would need a politics which is degraded, which sounds like populism. Populism is designed to work for degraded subjects who don't have capacities. But then if you say, well, we should just rebuild the capacities, then there's this temptation to blame bourgeois intellectuals for failing to build the educational institutions that would restore or create the capacities in the professionals, or to blame the proletariat for failing to take care of the lumpen proletariat and prevent the lumpen proletariat from slipping into its abyss, and to engage in that kind of, it's your community, you ought to take care of those people, what's wrong with you, finger pointing, which often goes on in a different part of our culture, and usually not under the name of the left, but sometimes. That's kind of what I have to start.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, I can respond to that, and I want Derick's thoughts on that, Benjamin. And I'm not surprised that you produce these incredible insights. Thank you for those insights, and thank you for reading the book seriously. And I hope the comrades from Geese magazine are listening, by the way. Ha ha ha. We just had our first critical review. It's good to have a critical review, spicing things up. Yeah. What I gathered from your thoughts was a very interesting conception of what we might call what the concept that we invoke of the class alter ego, and that class alter ego is actually quite important, despite the fact that liberal meritocracy has been in some kind of decline or stagnation. We still see degrees of class mobility, and the importance there of what you call of the fallen and the rump professional. We have a different way to taxonomize those distinctions, but nonetheless, we still insist that those distinctions are important. And we use the idea from Polansis, and I want your thoughts on this, that there is a kind of ideology, a class ideology that can be thought or theorized through proximity to the responsibility of management of surplus value extraction within different industries or within different organizations. And therefore, there's a kind of way to still talk about the persistence of bourgeois ideology, because bourgeois ideology can be kind of indexed to agents that are responsible for the maintenance of the status quo, and therefore of relations of domination and regression. And so the professionals that are at a remove from that nexus of domination possess a certain advantage for socialism in our contention. And moreover, I would say it's not as much about blaming classes and individuals associated with classes for their degraded capacities, as much as it is an educative, pedagogic necessity to develop civil society institutions that can promote a new form of class literacy, so that we can start to see, and this is what populism does not allow us to do, to start to see our subjectivity in class power lens, through class power lens, which is not to say this is some kind of reductionist. We only see our subjectivity through that, but at least in the field of political operations and power and so on, we feel that the populist moment has deprived us of that, you see. And so, I'm very curious how you think we navigate the crisis of PMC debate, because we argue that there's a latent populist tendency for homogenizing the PMC problem. Do you find the Polansis solution, which again, John and Barbara Ehrenreich were pushing against Polansis, and we kind of go back to that originary intervention of their famous essay on the PMC, and we say, wait a second, while we don't agree with the entirety of Polansis's positions, we do kind of agree that he allows us to see the PMC as a class strata that's internally contradictory, because that seems to allow us to isolate potential political agents within the PMC that can be primed for socialist activity, if that makes sense. So I want to dig in more to that debate. How do you see Polansis in particular? And what did you think about the concept, which we got from Goran Terborn, of course, of class alter ideologies? It also helps us address a problem which Derick and I, which you didn't mention, but which you probably were aware of the riddle of class origins in the mix of all of this, which is something that we kind of address in a tangential way. But if you've listened to Derick and I talk before, you'll know that this is something that it's like a riddle to us, how to properly address that issue and problem. Those are some questions that I have to you. I know that's a lot. Maybe you could respond or riff on some of those.
Yeah, so my impulse is not to think that populism got rid of the civil social organizing, but that the collapse of the civil social organizing led people to come up with populism as a sort of desperate adaptation to that condition. So rather than position the populists as the cause of that condition, I would say that the populists are an attempt to deal with that, an attempt that has failed, but nonetheless was an attempt. So then my impulse would be to say that one of the reasons that we have corporatism is this lumpenizing tendency. As lumpen elements emerge and there seems to be less cohesion and less sociability, then there's this demand for corporatizing of social relations, administering and bringing in laws and formal procedures and things. And I think that the professionals, including even the rump professionals, should not really be construed as privileged actors who have a lot of capacity. I don't think of them as the cause of the situation or the problem. I kind of think of them as stuck in increasingly corporatized industries, like YouTube, for instance, is a corporate industry under the Google Corporation with an algorithm that it controls that everyone who's on YouTube is subject to. And you don't have any kind of say with regard to YouTube. You're a supplicant. If YouTube demonetizes you, all you can do is beg them to not. And then it's an administrative process, and maybe there's an appeal, maybe there isn't. You don't really have any ability to have a deliberation with YouTube about whether you should be demonetized. And the same is also true for people who are in the university system or in legacy media. There's a kind of corporatizing of this, which makes the particular people, even those who do very financially well and so seem to be in advantaged positions, in practice be often in a state of fear or unease, or feeling lucky, like they were just able to, through good fortune, be able to subsist here. You often see with a lot of tenured academics, they'll say to students, well, don't go to grad school and don't try to do a PhD because it's only going to get worse. I was lucky, I got here, but you shouldn't follow. So there isn't like a taking of responsibility for the class or for the institution. To them, they are a subject of a corporation that doesn't really belong to them. They don't really identify with it. They don't think of themselves as having the power to control it. And this goes all the way up. And, even, oligarchs like Elon Musk, people are spending hundreds of millions of dollars in elections because they feel powerless. Billionaires are spending enormous amounts of money because they feel powerless. So my impulse is to kind of say that maybe what we're talking about here is something closer to the death of the social.
Yeah, that's helpful. Derick, I want to invite you to jump in to talk to Benjamin here and say hello and gather your thoughts on all of this. I'm very happy that you found our theory about lumpenization, which we use when we talk about the lumpen proletariat. We're talking about it as a verb, as a process of fragmentation, which is not only acutely affecting the lumpen as a empirical class position, but it's also a general process of class interest becoming more incoherent to all classes in a certain way. It's an idea of Marx from the Brumaire that we are working with. But Varn, why don't you jump in and say hello and let's gather your thoughts here.
Well, when I think about lumpenization, I think about a couple of different things. And one is the fragmentation of working class solidarity for a variety of reasons. And people tend to focus on it with immigrants because that's the most obvious one. It's also the one that many more trade-oriented liberals tend to care about. But there's actually sectional hostilities all over the working class, hostilities between different kinds of blue-collar labor, between blue and white-collar labor, between sectors of white-collar labor and other sectors of white-collar labor. And I have been thinking about the reasons for this. One is not to critique Conrad McNair, but I do think his point that we have had socialization through the welfare state is true, although I would say less true in America than in the UK, and most definitely less true than in Europe. But that also this has stalled out a long time ago for profitability reasons, going all the way back to the 1970s. Like the height of the welfare state has passed us now by 2 or 3 generations. But the size of the state itself has not gone away because the dependency on the state for management is everywhere. And I want to ask you about, what does that say about the powerlessness that all the contending classes seem to feel? Because we focus on it in the working class because it's, I think, the most acute in the working class and in the lumpenized. You have a general hostility to politics. When it does manifest, it tends to manifest as a distrust of political interventions, which can show up as wildly incoherent. In the UK, it's like, what, 50% of blue collar supports reform, although interestingly, that also implies 50% doesn't, and you don't hear about that. You also have this term racialized, as if when we were talking about the working class, we're only talking about the white working class, which, and I can tell you in Daniel and I's case, is never true. We are never just talking about the white working class. Perhaps having a lot of British speakers on today have confused people about this, but I don't know why the condition would be so over there anyway. One thing I would say, though, in this is lumpenization is a big problem because I see it as also the civil spaces that we used to have been cannibalized by both the state and the market. And in fact, the state has been enabling the market to do it. And I think this is what is sort of missed in a lot of these things about the welfare state, is that after the 1980s and during neoliberalization, I think Philip Murawski makes this history abundantly clear, the attempt to substitute the welfare state with markets, which people were captive in, but the government would ultimately backstop as a welfare itself, is a problem, and it's dependent on the same high profitability to work that the old welfare state was too. And so we have this issue where the civil spaces that people used to educate themselves that were outside of the state space, church, strong unions, other civic institutions like Shriners, these sorts of things, they don't exist in the same way anymore. They practically don't exist at all. And then conversely, when confronted with this fact, we get the two moralizing points of view, which is either the working class is not as moral as the middle class. Us middle class people care about immigrants. Well, yeah, some of them, the ones that you know about, are the ones in your own country. You don't give a shit about the imperial worldview, at least not in a practical way, because you can't do anything about it. I mean, like, this is not even a moral critique; it's just a fact. So this lumpinization can be hard to talk about because people don't want to deal with the seemingly the degradation of being a dependent on state actors, not in a voluntary association. You're not dependent on each other in a community in any meaningful sense. You are depending on a state actor who you have very little control over. And that, in addition, and this makes everyone uncomfortable, but I think you, of all people, probably write the most about it. There is no evidence whatsoever that popular opinion affects actual policy beyond getting people into office, which is why even left populists will focus on electoral wins and then shut the fuck up about policy wins. Like, they just don't talk about it very often, because even when they do get their policies, they often don't work, or they only work for 2 years and then they like don't talk about it anymore because it got complicated and we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to, you talk about, for example, I can think of some of them, such as drug decriminalization in the Northeast, which I support, but since it was done with no proper supports, it was kind of a fiasco. And so people touted its initial successes and then shut up when the evidence proved that it wasn't still being successful. And also, they just moved what they meant by success, because initially they were promised that if we legalized drugs, drug use would actually go down, ODs would go down. And in some cases they did, Portugal somewhat. In some cases they didn't, Oregon. But there's no real dealing with that, right? So this is all tied into lumpinization, because these kinds of consumption patterns often are a psychological replacement for community. And I also, people misread me as saying that I think the working class are victims. They are participating in this. They being the people who fall into it. And one of my points is, if we want to look at the sociological reasons for this, is because the working class is far more divided, even amongst itself, than it was through most of the 20th century. Now, it is a lot like what it was like in the 19th century, but people also don't want to think about that because other conditions are different. You can't have like street insurrections in the same way. A drone would take you out. So I wanted to, like, how do you think this plays into this seeming paralysis? Because even the bourgeoisie, and it may be self-fooling. They may be lying even to themselves, but they seem to feel like the deadlock is beyond their control.
Yeah, I think Tom Steyer has spent $500 million on losing 2 elections. Elon Musk spent a record-setting amount of money and was kicked out of office in disgrace without having accomplished anything, getting humiliated in briefings by members of Congress who could still get money from him, but nonetheless still thought it would be worthwhile to dump on him in the press. They don't seem to be feeling like they're in charge either at this stage. I do think that there's been a kind of general desocialization, which I almost want to associate with the process of modernization itself. There's an article I wrote, Debilitated Democracy, with Dirk Yorka from TU Darmstadt, about the kind of liquidation of the demos as a thing, because it is no longer unified enough to be able to have a will that is coherent, such that it can then act, or it can then check whether the representatives have done what it wills. It's no longer able to hold on to a notion of what it is that it wants for a unit of time that would allow it to do this. So then there's a question of whether you can have democracy in the sense of a demos that can exercise kratos in the old Greek sense. And then I think this applies just as well to any other unit, because people go, okay, if there's no democracy, then there must be aristocracy, then there must be an aristos. But just because there's no demos doesn't mean that there's an aristos. Doesn't mean that you have a group of people who actually have social and political capabilities and are able to organize. The people who are the richest in our society are typically people who are very good at navigating corporate structures and very good at begging the state for money. Which these are not the capabilities that we would historically associate with aristocrats, who typically were property holders who could come and meet and have political meetings with other property holders in assemblies. So I think that there is a kind of question of just whether the basic social or political capabilities are going to stick around. One thing I've noticed is that populist leaders who are viewed as sloppulist in their own time, they're viewed as having very flimsy commitments, nothing specific, nothing concrete. If you fast forward a generation, these people then get nostalgized as if they were deep thinkers who had all sorts of worked out and detailed ideas relative to those who have come later. So you get, this, Bush is no longer a stupid person who didn't know what he was doing. Bush becomes this intellectual Republican. And Ed Miliband now is the intellectual heavyweight inside the Labor Party. And his strategy of compelling private businesses to invest in the green transformation through a mix of deliberately making energy expensive by denying access to North Sea drilling and then also offering subsidies. This is, as you were saying, a kind of classic example of how to use the state to force the private sector to invest without having to directly increase or raise revenue. There is a kind of neoliberal way of having state-led private investment, state-led market development. And this seems to have become increasingly popular, and then even on the left at this point, because the left seems to have dropped its horizons. It no longer really thinks not only that the workers can do politics, it also doesn't think that there can be an overcoming of labor or an overcoming, a general reduction in the labor force participation rate, which would produce something like a Gore's subject. That's something also that the left no longer believes that it can do. And relative to where we are, this, the Gore's idea that people, once they're neat, not in education, employment, or training, would be able to do something else. This would seem to rely on their still being able to engage in social and political activities that would develop that into a form of consciousness. And I think you guys made a good point that the communization theorists and Gore's are kind of supposing there are these social capacities that can arise spontaneously in these people. And there's no reason to think that these things are there. They depend on forms of organizing and forms of activity that seem to have gone, and that nobody seems able to simply call back into existence. And whenever people go to what are examples of these forms of organizations, every type of organization they give is one that's in terrible crisis. You guys talked about in the book extensively, the labor unions are only 10% of the population. When you rely on the labor unions, you're relying on isolated sectoral entities that are not able to have broad solidarity with each other, with the rest of the population. And then you've got public sector unions where there's a dependency on the state. So, the alternative to that would be something like religious organizations. Those don't seem to really have any kind of legs. And I would classify the DSA at this point as an attempt to step into the church space. I think the DSA is an attempt to be a church. And I think that's the best way to understand it. Which is a little bit of a provocative position, but also I do kind of mean it. I think there's a sort of desperate attempt to furnish organizations of this type because the historical theory says that it's necessary. But in practice, when people try to construct these things, they don't really stick. There seems to be something about modernization that is killing these kinds of entities.
Benjamin, you've talked about Mamdani critically, and a couple of days ago we had the three candidates that he endorsed had a series of victories. Can you assess that? Can you talk about perhaps maybe even a prediction, if you would be so willing, where left populism might be headed if we see a kind of, at least in urban areas, the expansion of kind of Mamdani DSA, if the Democratic Party is able to sort of contain it and use it strategically to their advantage, where will left populism go in such a scenario?
I think it looks a lot like the current debate in the UK between the Blairites, who are for Americanization, the promotion of AI, and the promotion of defense spending, and the Miliband faction, which prioritizes net zero and climate change over those things, is willing to support and tolerate those things insofar as they are compatible with net zero and climate change. But what we have seen in the UK in the last few months now is that the Iran war created a crisis which polarized these elements and separated them like a sieve. So now we have the sort of green neo-left, which is interested in harm reduction. It's not so hardcore as to insist on degrowth, but it does want to reduce the harm of the growth by cleaning up the economy and making it green. And then conversely, a Blairite, more realpolitik oriented side, which thinks that you have to build up the military to deal with emerging threats in a potentially multipolar world. And that to do this, you're going to need a lot of AI, and therefore you're going to need to really cater to the tech sector and create a very happy environment for the tech sector to operate, which would include reducing energy costs as much as possible so that the data centers are cheap to run. And as soon as energy costs go up, these people can't sit in the same party anymore, and they become separated. And I think in the States, in part because the tech sector has tended to back Republicans recently, in the Democratic Party in the 2028 primaries, there will be an intense fight between a kind of Miliband left that I think will associate with people like Mamdani and AOC, and then a Blairite abundance left that I think will associate with people like Gavin Newsom.
That's very good prediction. Thank you. I knew you would have something good there. Well, comrades, we're way over time by what we intended, as always. But when we engage in these conversations, they're extremely thought-provoking, and honestly, it's just been incredible to share this stream with you, Varn, and to have you on, Benjamin, for these insights. We got to do it again. I really always benefit so much speaking to you. You can check out a great interview that I did with Benjamin Studebaker on the concept of the political. Very much enjoyed that. Benjamin, what are you working on right now? You've recently published a book. One of your first book is now available at an affordable price in paperback, The Chronic Crisis. The second book is now also available in paperback?
The second book is the affordable one right now. Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies is like out for $24.99. If you're in the UK, $19.99, I think, or even less.
Cool. Well, that's amazing. Yeah. Well, you know, this book here, by the way, the book that we are here to convene about, The People Are Not One, Socialist Strategy After Left Populism, in fact, is available, depending on where you're based in the world, for, let's see, what's it going for in the UK? In print, or sorry, in the US, $13.99. Only $13.99. How can you? And you heard it from Benjamin Studebaker. I mean, if Benjamin Studebaker is sold, you must be sold. I'm sorry to tell you. So everybody watching, if you would do us the honor to read this book, share with friends, family, etc., we would love it. We'd love it for you to promote Revol, but also to support Derick and I's work. We want to write more together. Benjamin, you've done co-writing, and you've enjoyed the process of co-writing, right?
Yeah. My article that I published in the European Journal of Social Theory was with Dirk Jurka. That was a great time, and hopefully something that we'll get to further develop.
Yeah, indeed. We enjoyed it as well. I think we will close the stream. I want to kick it over to Derick Varn for some final thoughts. Benjamin, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, guys.
We'll see you soon. But I think Derick and I will close her out. Varn, any words of wisdom before we leave the masses? I would not say the people.
I would say that what we were trying to do with this book was to get people to think about what socialist strategy would really be from a theoretically informed perspective that was also one that was rooted in empirical data, and to move beyond nostalgia. I do get that some people are going to wish that this book was 50 other books. So some people would rather that we had one singular definition of populism, since we deal with it historically. And the definition moves throughout history. Or people would want us to talk about exactly what they should do at their local tenants union to somehow overthrow the capitalist system tomorrow. Or what we think Mamdani should do to bring in socialism in one borough. Or anything like that. And I think a lot of people will be challenged by this book, and they might be frustrated by it, because we actually, I think you and I both readily recognize that if we gave every single specific strategy or handled everything that people want a book like this to be, it would be a dishonest book. We are dealing with populism as it has emerged now in its history in the 20th century and the Marxist response to it. And it is a floating subject because class collaborationism is a floating subject, frankly. Populism ain't even the only form of it. It's just the one that is most readily available for a secular world. That doesn't have like the church arguing for distributism or some idea of inherent class collaboration mandated by Dharma or God. So those things are foreclosed to us and to populists. And I think if people approach it like that and take that as a call to take what we say as the theoretical limits of certain strategies and start developing them out, this is a participatory project and book. This is a call for you to finish what we started. And we're also going to continue working on what we started. Daniel and I have already talked about other things we're going to do. So yeah. I'm going to turn it over to Daniel.
Yeah. And, come to our live events. Every event we've made a pact will be its own thing. We'll have a panel of left-wing socialist people in that city that we'll be in dialogue with. So we're not going to be rehashing or repeating ourselves. And this is a commitment we have. We want this to be a practical set of conversations. And we really hope that and if you want to host this in your town, in your city, you can also reach out to us. Pending on budget, of course. But I think, we'll close for now, friends and comrades. Thank you all for a wonderful stream. Be sure to get the book. And until next time.